Hey guys, TechPerson here, and today I'm going to be discussing the technical aspects of Celeste movement mechanics, as well as how to exploit them to complete the A, B, and C sides. I'll be covering the basics, as well as nearly every technique mentioned on the Celeste wiki, linked in the description as a primary source for this video. If you're looking for a general overview of the game's story and chapter layout instead, I highly recommend Speed9052's video on it, also linked in the description. Before I get started, I should mention I've segmented this video based on the platforming elements and specific techniques involved, and I've dropped timestamps, you guessed it, in the description. Before I cover any specific technique, I'm going to introduce two very important concepts that make some techniques easier or possible for humans when they otherwise wouldn't be. In short, Celeste implements both input buffering and coyote time. Trying to perform an action up to 5 frames before you can buffers the input and performs it after the input. Trying to do something you can only do on the ground will succeed up to 5 frames after you leave the ground. Like many platformers, you can walk and jump with a varying height. Jumping gives you a small and short speed boost, which isn't used much because of dashes, but more on those later. Celeste's mid-air control is better than in most games, though you'll still have more friction on the ground. Friction is a double-edged sword. When you want to retain momentum, you might jump the instant you touch the ground to minimize the effects of friction. Wall jumps are responsive and also vary in height, but can be made neutral if you aren't moving towards the wall when you jump, providing a method to scale wall without stamina or dashes. Wall jumping actually works off the very top of a wall, but when Madeline grabs it, she slides down. By using a neutral to reach the top of the wall again, you can climb jump or jump from there and cover a 5-tile gap, hence why this technique is called a 5 jump. When Madeline is moving the same direction as a spike, she doesn't take damage from it regardless of whether it's on a wall or not. Because of this, you can actually kick off a wall of spikes behind you, which is sometimes called a spike jump. Grabbing is fairly self-explanatory. Besides just hanging onto a wall and slowly draining stamina, you can also climb up and down, which uses even more. You can also jump while clinging to a wall, which eats stamina too. When you run out of stamina, you can still dash if you have one, and wall jump, but can't grab onto walls until you touch the ground again. Some objects in the game, specifically jellies and crystallized theo, can be held and thrown. Holding down before throwing the object gently drops it instead, and throwing it behind you gives a small boost. Pressing down crouches on the ground, and gives you a downward boost while in the air. You can also jump and move around while crouched to keep your hitbox low. Although you can't grab while crouched, you can perform a simple dash technique known as a demo. Speaking of dashing, Celeste also gives you an 8-directional dash, but that doesn't mean much without explaining what a dash does. Dashes have several useful properties, which when combined makes them extremely versatile. Typically, a dash overrides your current velocity rather than adding to it, a valuable feature for positioning while moving quickly. When other inputs don't occur mid-dash, the distance it carries you is constant, and all dashes except downward diagonal dashes zero your speed when and if they end mid-air, but more on this later. Dashes have a ton of techniques doable with just a platform and a wall. Jumping while dashing along the ground performs a super, which retains some momentum from the dash and results in a high, short arc. Dashing diagonally into the ground and jumping in the latter half of the dash where you slide against the ground is called a hyper, and results in a low and long arc. Jumping just before touching the ground during a hyper produces a wavedash, which also restores your dash when done properly and can therefore be chained. Wavedashes vary in length based on how well you time the dash, and will decay into a hyper or extended hyper if your jump is too late. More on extensions later. Wallbounces are just vertical supers that also work when exiting a bubble or dashing upward through screens. While bouncing off vertically moving kevins, zippers, and dash blocks gives you more height and restores your dash. Reversing, a dash technique, is done by switching directions between the dash and the jump to apply the momentum in a direction opposite the original dash. All dash-based techniques except demos and wallbounces can be reversed in this way. Hypers and supers can be extended by touching the ground long enough to restore Madeline's dash before jumping. Understanding ultras requires some further background on dash mechanics, which can be summarized as follows. Downward diagonal dashes are special. Why are downward diagonal dashes special? I speculate the peculiar nature of downward diagonal dashes comes from the dev's reasoning on how dashes should interact with the ground and walls. If any dash towards a platform ends before or as it touches the surface, Madeline just stays still afterward. If Madeline dashes horizontally or vertically into a surface, she just splats into it. Diagonal dashes are strange in general because it doesn't quite feel natural and fluid for a diagonal dash into non-diagonal platforms to just cancel the dash, but obviously it can't just keep going that direction. The solution was simple, or so the devs thought. Diagonal dashes into walls become vertical for the remaining duration, and diagonal dashes into a ceiling or floor become horizontal. Now, conceivably, since diagonal dashes into the ceiling are rare and there isn't too much friction to move there anyway, they were ignored. Diagonal dashes into walls just zero horizontal momentum and make it vertical, but diagonal dashes downward into the ground are a problem because contact with the ground provides a lot of friction and would make the latter half of a downward diagonal dash feel unnaturally dampened. Long story short, the developers applied an uncapped 1.2x speed multiplier once Madeline touches the ground during or after a downward diagonal dash. But why uncapped? Ordinary dashes in Celeste zero your momentum if they end midair, so theoretically the multiplier would only be applicable to whatever momentum the last dash granted you and not anything before that, except for the second component of Ultras. This part of why Ultras work is, to me, more confusing to explain in terms of what the devs were thinking. Downward diagonal dashes are special in another way I've already mentioned. They don't zero Madeline's speed after a dash ends midair, and instead keep whatever horizontal momentum existed before the dash started. If I were required to speculate as to why this preserves momentum, I'd likely blame some obscure programming, edge case, and dash cancellation logic. But to preserve the accuracy of this video, I'm not going to pretend to understand why downward diagonal dashes do this. Exploiting both of these odd properties of downward diagonal dashes allows Madeline to traverse immense chasms and, in certain situations, achieve ludicrous speeds. To perform an ultra, gain some momentum with a hyper or wave dash, then dash diagonally downward to preserve that momentum, touch the ground after the dash finishes, and collect your hard-earned 1.2x speed multiplier. Give yourself room to complete the downward diagonal dash before touching the ground, or you'll end up chaining hypers instead. Also, make sure not to jump before touching the ground at the end, or you likely won't get the speed multiplier because input buffering in Celeste technically makes it possible to jump without touching the ground depending on your exact height. Ultras are one of the more exploity feeling dash techniques because they have no velocity cap, allow for a full height jump, and don't leave ring particles, unlike the others. Despite originally being unintended behavior, Celeste developers, like any good game developers, have since embraced it as a fun and useful feature. Another technique which could be considered exploitive is a Cornerboost, or C-boost. If you thought that last technique was strange, brace yourself. Cornerboosts involve Madeline climb jumping off the very top of a corner she's moving towards before touching it, which isn't necessarily possible if you have over 180 speed. If successful, this preserves momentum and adds 40 speed. C-boosts are easier after a dash, which works because Cornerboosts cancel dashes and prevent them from zeroing Madeline's movement like usual. Downward Cornerboosts don't preserve momentum unless they're perfect 2 pixels from the wall when executed. Performing the latter half of a 5 jump after moving towards a wall results in a corner boost, which is called a 6 jump instead because it tramples an extra tile. Dashes also have interesting interactions with a majority of the game's entities. Pressing dash while in a bubble doesn't dash, but it does make it move sooner, which is called fastbubbling. Madeline can jump at the end of a dream block after dashing into it for a horizontal and vertical boost. Jumping just before exiting the dream block, then jumping as you exit gives you the same height, but with 40 extra speed. You can also use a dash to perform a hyper, demo hyper, or super directly out of a dream block, though only the first two are really practical. Holding a diagonal direction when entering a feather grants an initial speed boost, apparently. Jumping off a lava block just before it breaks gives you a 2.25x vertical speed multiplier plus some horizontal speed based on your launch angle. Hypers and supers can be executed off the last few frames of these lava blocks too. I don't really like lava blocks, so I didn't test this one extensively. Getting near a fish, touching a bumper, or being near an exploding seeker obviously gives you some momentum, and you can get a bonus 50 speed by holding the same direction of the boost. Shortly after they hit a wall, Madeline can bounce off the side of a seeker for momentum and a dash refresh. Grabbing crystallized Theo or a Jellybrella during a dash preserves momentum, and you can ungrab, dash, then re-grab both for some extra distance, though this is more difficult with Theo. This also preserves the momentum from a grounded ultra, apparently. Again, I don't have the skill to test all of these, I'm not a wizard, okay? Holding jump when landing on a Shiro, a snowball, seeker, or fish preserves some momentum, including dash momentum, and gives extra height. If a bubble is on the ground, you can perform a hyper or super out of it. During coyote frames, you can dash into the bubble, jump before you touch it, and launch yourself with the momentum of a super, I guess. Clouds give you an upward boost based on what position they're at and not how long you've been on them, so you can short jump onto a cloud to trigger it and jump again to get the full boost. Madeline can supposedly perform supers, hypers, and hyper bunny hops on a cloud as it moves upwards, but I sure can't. Binoculars unload off-screen spinners, which can let you dash through them. Bubbles can be entered while crouched, which moves the bubble upward 2 pixels. The wiki also lists obscure tech, some of which is TAS only or just for show, so I'll only be covering the ones I found interesting. Skipping some cutscenes only teleports Madeline horizontally. allowing some specific shortcuts. Skipping cutscenes also cancels dashes, which can preserve momentum if done within the first few frames of a cutscene to stop the cutscene itself from decreasing your speed. And that's all the techniques I have for now. Hopefully this was helpful and enables you to accomplish whatever extraordinarily difficult challenge you face in the future. If I missed anything important or got something wrong, do let me know in the comments. I might consolidate corrections in a pinned message if it comes to that. Thanks for watching.
The only game.
Peter, watch this. I'm gonna die.
No way. No way. No way. No way that worked. This is illegal.